The gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. And I appreciate the song that Daryl picked out for us because it talks about the foundation upon which the church is built. And that is the reason that we are able to say that the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. We'll talk about exactly what that means and we'll try to apply it. But we'll also start out with this thought. And this is well documented in history. The fall of Rome happened not necessarily, at least because of outside factors, but because of internal ones. So there was pressure from the north and from the east of certain barbaric tribes that were trying to overthrow Roman power. There were also a lot of rebellions happening in the empire, but not even that on the internal front, but instead the political turmoil is ultimately what leads to the fall of Rome. So was it possible that any group of Huns or Ostrogoths or Vandals or any group that was coming toward the Roman Empire, could they have conquered it? Probably not. Probably never, unless the Roman Empire from within collapses. And it does. And the question is, well, what can prevail against the church? The gates of Hades from the outside? No. But is there something that could still affect us? So let's get a little bit of context for our verse here, starting with verse 13 of Matthew chapter 16. Verse 13 says, when Jesus came into the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked the disciples a certain question. So when he came into this region, Caesarea Philippi, then these things took place. Does it matter where you are when you're reading the Bible? Yes, and I don't mean in this building, but I mean it matters where you are at in the text, who it is that's speaking, of course, but also where you're at on the map. And right now we're in Caesarea Philippi, or at least the area around it. Well, why does that matter? Well, it matters a little bit because Caesarea Philippi was established by Herod, and it is a city that is laid out according to the Roman city structure, and it would have the Roman-style marketplace, and it was largely settled by Romans that had been moved into the area, and so it is more Roman than it is Jewish. So when Jesus is here, he is nearly in a different country from Israel. And so we see him in Caesarea Philippi here, but right before this, if you go back farther in chapter 16 and then in chapter 15, like in verse 21, you'll see that Jesus has been other places as well. He's been all around the Sea of Galilee, which really only the western side of the Sea of Galilee was Jewish. The eastern side was much more Greek. And then he's been in the region of Tyre and Sidon as well, which are more heavily Greek influenced and never really were held for very long by Israel. And so Jesus has been a lot of places, some of them Jewish, most of them not. And so when in verse 13 he asks the question, who do men say that I am? Well, the apostles that have been with him, traveling all over, they've probably heard a whole lot of different explanations because they've been in all kinds of different cultures over just the last couple of weeks of travel here. So who do men say that I am? Well, the Jews say one thing, and other people say something else, and you've gotten to hear it all, so who do people say that I am? So this question then, hopefully, is helped a little bit by understanding of a little bit of context here, but in one sense, when Jesus asked this question, you can kind of say, why does it matter? You say, why does it matter if someone says Jesus is one thing or another thing? Does that really affect who Jesus is? No. No, and if I say that Jesus is a false teacher, does that make him any less true than he really is? No. So does it matter what men say? In one sense, no. But Jesus wants to know, at least to be able to correct them as to what they should believe. But what are some answers that are given? We hopefully are familiar with this text anyway. They say a few things. Maybe John the Baptist, maybe Elijah, maybe Jeremiah, maybe another prophet altogether. None of those guesses are too close. Of course, it can't be John because John was just here and people thought maybe he came back from the dead. It's a little superstitious. They thought maybe Elijah, but John was that Elijah that would return that was promised in Malachi chapter 4, so it can't be him. Jeremiah, I don't really get exactly why they thought he might be Jeremiah, but he's not a good guess either. The best guess might be Moses, since he's a prophet that arose like Moses did from among his people. But regardless of the guess, all of them are wrong. They're close, And in reality, they're good things. They're good people to be compared to. They're good religious figures, and they think at least that Jesus is a good man, a good teacher, if not even a prophet. So that's great, but that's not the true answer to the question. And of course, Jesus will receive the true answer from Peter here in the text as well. And that's the big question, verse 15. But who do you say that I am? And of course, there's a whole sermon, a very good sermon, to be preached from just this verse, because this is the question of life. On an individual basis, who do you say that Jesus is? Well, that determines everything else in your life and after this life is over. So who do you say that Jesus is? Well, in Peter's case, he makes the good confession, it's called sometimes. But Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Well, that's a pretty good answer. So Peter gives the correct answer, the best answer maybe that you can give, saying you are the Christ, that is the Messiah, the God's anointed. Not only are you the Messiah, the promised one to come from the Old Testament, but also you are the Son of God. You are deity itself. So he's saying the two things that Jesus is most essentially. He is the promised Messiah that would be anointed by God to do his work on earth, and he is, in fact, the Son of God. Very true. So Peter gets kudos for that, but for us, we're going to focus a little bit farther down in the text. So we're going to keep going with this, verse 17. Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. Some people draw the comparison between verses 16 and 17. Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then Jesus turns around and phrases it kind of the same way to say, and you are Simon, the son of Jonah. I'm Christ, the Son of God. You are Simon, the son of Jonah. It's just kind of a mirroring there. But he says, you're blessed because you didn't get this from humans. Humans don't know this. Well, they didn't recognize it. And obviously that's true because they thought he was John the Baptist or Jeremiah, so they didn't get it. But instead, God has revealed this to Peter. And in verse 18, where we'll spend some time, he says, I say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock, and we understand that rock to be the foundational truth of Christ, that he is both the Messiah and the Son of God. So on that truth, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. Okay. So let's start with our phrase then. I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. Let's start with the first part of that actually before the gates of Hades, which is I will build my church. Now, of course, we say on the one hand, it is my church, not Isaac's church, but it is Christ's church. It's his church alone. He is the sole proprietor of it. He is the owner of it. So it is his church that he's making. But he says, I will build it. That word in particular in Greek that means will build, I will build, it means to build up from a foundation. So it actually already presupposes that there is a foundation. It would be kind of like in English us saying that I will frame my church on top of this foundation that's already been poured. So I'm going to add on to it, but that's just the structural layer. So I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. Okay. Well, what about the gates of Hades? What exactly are the gates of Hades? That's kind of a strange phrase to use. So let's break it down a little bit. Let's start with gates. Now again, if you go back to the original language, you're going to see that gates is maybe not what we think of when we think of a gate. In fact, I've been quite guilty of this before looking at this lesson. Usually if I think of a gate, and even in this context, I would usually think of a picket fence with a garden gate. And I would think, okay, well, the garden gate of Hades won't be open against the church. So that's nice. That's not really what it's talking about. But this word for gate here is used usually to refer to the gates of a city. And so the city of Jerusalem or other cities, the gates of them in ancient times would be pretty impressive. In fact, the walls themselves were impressive, usually at least 10 feet high, sometimes 15 or 20 feet high, and usually at least 5 feet thick, but sometimes 10 or 20 feet thick. So the walls themselves are impressive, which means the gates are pretty impressive as well. And the gates would be usually somewhere between 10 and 15 feet wide and just as tall. So again, 10 to 15 feet wide. And the gates themselves, the gates are about 7 feet across. Each door to the gate would be that wide, and it would be just as tall. So it's an impressive structure, much more so than we would consider a gate today, perhaps. But that's the implication. So these gates are being open. It's kind of like saying the floodgates of Hades will be open. It's saying there will be a big problem here. In fact, because this phrase is usually used in regard to cities, you can look at it in sort of a similar way to say that even if someone breaches the gates of the church, if Hades is to breach the gates of the church, it won't matter, because nothing is going to prevail against the church. So that's the gates part, and then Hades. Well, what is Hades? Some translations translate this as hell, which is, I don't know if it's a better translation or a worse translation. The problem is Hades can mean a lot of different things, and from Greek it's the same word, it's Hades. So it means a place of the dead, but it can properly mean, and is used in Scripture to mean, the place of the dead. Also, it means hell, as in where the devil resides, is forced to reside. It can also mean the grave, as in just where people go after they die in general. It can also mean somewhere that is unseen. So it can have a lot of different meanings. And so when we put it back into this phrase, the gates of Hades, really that phrase could have a lot of different meanings. But we'll talk about 3 meanings that are suggested by different scholars, and we'll look at them and see what makes sense. So the gates of Hades, what could they be? Well, number one, the gates of Hades could be referring to death. So we said that it's the place of the dead. That's what Hades is in general terms. So the gates of Hades could mean death. And it could be that Christ is saying that death will not prevail against the church. You could take that different ways. At least 2 different ways come to mind. You could say, one, that death, as in the death of members over time, will not prevail against the church, because the church started 2,000 years ago. How many of the original members of the church are still alive today? How many original members of this church at Maple Avenue are still alive today? Death is a reality within the church, and yet the church still goes on. And so in that sense, certainly the gates of Hades, if they represent death, that means that the church will continue in spite of death. The other way you could look at that with death is persecution. And certainly the church has been persecuted time and time again, and many people have been put to death, and yet the church is still here. So one sense that you could take this would be death. A second meaning for the gates of Hades, potentially, that's suggested is sin. That sin will not prevail against the church. So sin certainly has an impact on the church. And you could take that a couple different ways as well. You could say that the sin of society outside of the church will not prevail against the church. That the sin of culture will not come into the church and destroy the church. On the other hand, you could say that sin from the inside, even that, won't cause the death of the church. It can cause a lot of harm, but it won't necessarily cause the death of the whole church. And sin has even killed entire individual congregations. But on the whole, sin, even as the gates of Hades, will not prevail against it. Third potential meaning for the gates of Hades would be Satan himself. Well, that could be a possibility as well. So the powers of Satan, while he does have power, it is nothing compared with the church. And the church is built on the foundation of Christ. If you put Christ against Satan, then Christ wins every time. And so that could certainly be true as well. And Satan does try with all of his ability to get rid of the church. He wants the church to cease to exist, and yet Christ says that's not going to happen. Even the gates of Hades, even Satan himself will not prevail. So which is the true meaning of the gates of Hades? Well, the simple answer is it's probably all of them, and it's probably more than that. What is Jesus trying to exclude when he says the gates of Hades will not prevail against it? Is he trying to say that something will prevail? It's an inclusive phrase. It means anything that you can think of that pertains to the gates of Hades doesn't matter. It's not going to overcome the church. So is it sin? Sure. Is it Satan? Sure. Is it death? Sure. It's all of those, and probably more. But the good thing is, Christ says it doesn't matter. Those things will not stack up against the church. So the question, though, if we know that to be the case, then why do we still have fear sometimes? Then why do we still act afraid as if the church is at risk of failing? So do we believe that in reality, or do we just believe that on paper? And that's what we're going to spend some time looking at the application of this lesson for. So to start with, for the application, how we can take this phrase, this idea, and work it into what we understand. Let me go back into history, not this far back into history actually, but into American history. There is a well-known document that comes from a well-known speech called the Gettysburg Address. You're probably familiar with it. And it was spoken by Lincoln after the Battle of Gettysburg in the Civil War. And in that speech, there's a lot of famous lines, individual lines from it, but toward the end of this very short speech, he says a phrase that sounds a lot like what we're talking about, and we're going to tie it in. So toward the end, Lincoln says, "We here highly resolve," so we want this to happen, "we highly resolve that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." What is he saying? He's saying with everything we have, if it's up to us, if we're capable of doing something about it, then this form of government that's been established, it'll continue. And by extension, this country that it is founded upon this form of government, it will continue. He says it shall not perish. The gates of Hades, in effect, will not prevail against it. Now, in some sense, I believe that to be true, and it's worked pretty well for a long time, and it's been a long time since Lincoln said that. At the same time, is it possible that this form of government and that this country will perish? Is that possible? Yeah, it is. But it depends on how highly resolved people are to make sure that that doesn't happen. But when we look at this, and then we look at the church and we say, okay, well, if I'm going to believe that the United States of America shall not perish, what evidence do I have for that? What promise do I have for that? Well, really, it's just me. It's just us. It's just what people are willing to do and how highly resolved they are to make it happen. But when I look at the church, is that the case? When I look at the church, do I have to rely on just me? Do I have to think, well, if it's us, and if we don't get this done, then the church will fail entirely? Well, no, because I don't rest on the promise of any individual person, but I rest on the promise that God has given through Christ, that the church being built on the foundation of Christ will not fail. It will not perish from the earth. Even if everything else does, it'll be the last to go before Christ returns. It will not perish, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. So while I hope that America won't perish, I know that the church will not. And I hope you think that too. But if we think that, then why do we say some of the things that we do? And why do we think some of the things that we think? And why do we act in certain ways? Why does it not seem like we always reflect this promise that's given through Christ? If you're talking about the country as a whole, then I think probably a lot of people have fears about the course of the country. They have fears about the continued existence of the country. And what things might you be afraid of? Well, there's a lot of things that could come to mind. So let's list a few. And we'll say, well, if I'm afraid that America may perish, or that the gates of Hades, in theory, would prevail against America, well, what's going to make that happen? I don't know. Let's see. It could be culture in general. We say, okay, well, culture's changing. And it could be right along with that a progressivism of sorts, moving farther and farther from traditional values. We could say maybe it's politics in general. Maybe it's a president in particular, whether this one or the last one or the one before that, or maybe the next one. And we say, okay, maybe that's the case. Or maybe it's COVID. Maybe that's what's going to bring America to its knees finally. Or maybe it's China, or maybe it's big tech, or maybe it's inflation, or maybe it's recession, or fill in the blank. And you say, okay, well, I'm afraid of those things. Could America fall because of one of those things, or a combination of them? Yep, it could. Can the church fall because of one of those things? Because of all of those things put together? Nope. It will not happen. The gates of Hades will not prevail against it. And yet, I think a lot of us kind of put these two things together and say, well, I'm afraid of all these things for the nation, and I think they might affect the church the same way. I'm afraid the nation might fail, and I'm afraid the church might fail. Can we be afraid that the church will fail as a whole and still believe in what Jesus spoke here? They are contradictory. They do not fit together. If I believe that the gates of Hades will not prevail against the church that Jesus built, if I believe that, then I'm not afraid of those other things impacting the church to the point that it cannot function any longer. So when we look at this and we show fear, the question, I guess, becomes this: is the church invincible? Is the church indestructible? Is the church incapable of ever failing? And in a certain sense, you'd say yes. And that's what we're trying to say here. We're saying yes. If I look at this in terms of what we've spoken of already, in that sense, the church as a whole shall not perish from the earth. True. Okay. It will not go away. And if I look back in the past, especially, and I don't think we look into the past enough, especially in regard to the church, what has the church already gone through? What have the gates of Hades already put out there to try to stop the church? There was something about some Jews that wanted to kill the founder of the church, and they did. There was something about the Jews continuing to persecute the church after it was founded, and then the Roman church for the next few hundred years. And then after the Roman church, of course, you have Catholicism that tries to wipe out any true form of Christianity. And then you have Islam that tries to do the same. And then you have the results of the Reformation. You have Darwinism. You have relativism that we're kind of in right now. And you say, well, the church has kind of been around for a while, and it's taken a few hits, but it's still there. Well, why is that? Because Jesus promised it would be. So in that sense, yes, the church is invincible. It is incapable of ever failing. On the other hand, is the church invincible? It is as a whole, but that doesn't mean it is for each individual congregation. So there are things, not outside forces. I still believe even on the individual level for the congregation that the gates of Hades will not prevail against the Maple Avenue Church of Christ or any other. Not the outside factors. Not Satan, not sin, not death. Those won't do it. But what could? What has the potential? Well, a few different things. Let's start with one. Let's start with apathy. If a congregation does not care, and they don't care about what happens in the church, and they don't really care about the future of the church, then guess what can prevail against that church? The gates of Hades, certainly. More specifically, we could say that death can prevail. Why? Because if we don't care, and our kids don't care, and nobody really cares too much about the church, it's just kind of everyone's responsibility, so nothing gets done, well then slowly, people will die off, and they'll keep dying off until there's just a couple of people left, and they can't afford to stay, so they close the doors, and that's the end of the church. Why? Was it because of the great power of Satan? Nope. It was because of apathy. It was because of an internal weakness that happened, because we didn't care quite enough. Second thing would be distraction or priorities, a lack of priorities. When everything else in life is first. And when I work everything else in life, I work church into my schedule, and I work serving God into my schedule, and everything else is first and Christ is second, well, what's going to happen? If I prioritize everything else, and if this congregation prioritizes everything else and loses sight of God or loses sight of our first love, as Revelation puts it, then what's going to happen? Well, that is when we allow the gates of Hades, this time we could say maybe sin, to enter in. And we say, well, everything else was a bigger priority, so I didn't really deal with that issue, whether in my own life or I didn't deal with that as the congregation. Sure, we had that problem where somebody was caught up in sin, but we didn't want to talk to them because, well, we were busy. What's going to happen? Well, the church will fail. Because of some great external pressure, because culture is changing? No, because we didn't address the problem because something else seemed more important at the time. And then the third thing. Like I've said throughout this lesson, on paper, we understand that the gates of Hades will not prevail against the church. But then what do we say? What do we show? And a lot of times we show fear. And we say things. And we say things like, well, these kids, they have it so much harder today. And I just don't know if they're going to be able to do what we were able to do with the church. Or I say something like, well, the way our country's going, I just don't know. Or I look around the church and I say, well, people just aren't as interested as they used to be. And I look back to the past and I say, well, we used to be able to get so many people in here and people just aren't interested, so I just don't know. Or I say, well, I'm just worried about the future generations of the church, or I'm worried about this, or I'm worried about that. And I say, I just don't know. I just don't know about the future of the church. Have you ever heard that? You ever felt that? When I say, well, I just don't know, the fortunate thing is I don't have to know individually because I've already been told. So if you say, well, I don't know about the future of the church, well, I do, because it's written right here. And Christ knows about the future of the church, and he knows what our children are going to face. And he knows what the future generations will have to go through. And he knows people aren't interested, and that's a cultural issue. He's aware of that too. He already knows. But the problem is, if we as a congregation, if we individually as Christians live in fear, then what's going to happen? Fear, if we allow it, if the congregation reacts out of fear, then Satan, the gates of Hades, in this case Satan, will prevail against the church. Actually, scratch that. If we react out of fear as a congregation, then Satan has already prevailed against the church. We cannot live as if this promise didn't exist. We can't act as if this promise didn't exist. I know things can be difficult. I know things can get scary. I get down about the church sometimes, and you do too. But this is here for a reason. Maybe we need to remind ourselves a little bit more of that reason. So, are any of these things that we've talked about great external threats to the church? Not the things that will kill the church from the inside. Those are the things that, while we might focus more on the bigger issues outside of it, and we might gloss over some of those internal problems, what is going to be the downfall of the church if it happens? It's not the outside, but it's the inside. It's not the whitewashed tombs, it's the inward rotting of men's bones, as Jesus says it. It's not the outside of the dish that needs to be cleaned, just a little bit more shine on it. It's the inside of the cup that has to be washed. So, however you want to phrase it, it is the internal more than the external. But the church can resist any outside threat, and this church can. But it can't overcome itself. And it can't overcome people that are unwilling to work in the church and people that are unwilling to trust that the church will prevail. The foundation of the church is Christ. The foundation of the church, fortunately, is not us. We are built upon the church, upon that rock, but we aren't the foundation. So this morning, I hope all this makes sense. I hope it's beneficial. But I hope, if nothing else, you leave today knowing that nothing is going to stop the church. Nothing is going to kill the church. Nothing is going to overcome the church. And the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. But this morning, as an individual Christian, you can be overcome awfully easily. As an individual Christian, the gates of Hades can prevail against you quite easily especially if you separate yourself from the congregation, but of course also if you're not a child of God to begin with, then Satan already has his hold on you. And this morning we want to change that. If there's anything we can do to help you to make that change, or if there's anything else that you need from the congregation this morning, or if you want to step up and volunteer to do more for the congregation, this is your opportunity as we stand, as we sing.
What can wash away my